Okay, this is English 201, week 5, part 1. When we last left off last week, I would say last week. For me, it was yesterday. I filmed like all first 4 weeks of class like 2 days ago, and now I'm back making more of them. But it wasn't. It was only 2 days ago for me, but it was a long time ago for you. The we were going over Kafka, and I read the first section of I read Kafka's The Metamorphosis. The story's divided into 3 parts, and what we've done so far is I read the first part and discussed the first part, and now I'm almost done reading the second part. So I'd like to kind of pick up reading the second part where I left off. So I think that's what I'm going to do for starters. Where I left off was in the middle of page 12. I am on the paragraph that begins. Oh, sorry. I am on the paragraph that begins. They had not allowed themselves a long rest. So that is where I am. So I'm just going to pick it up from last time, just right where I left off. Previously on Kafka. On the metamorphosis. Previously on the metamorphosis. On the metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa transformed into a giant bug. Can't go to work. His family, he and his father gets very angry and scares him and puts him back in his room. And the family doesn't know what to do because he was the primary breadwinner of the family. Part one basically is turned to a bug, and the boss gets mad at him because he didn't go into work on a 5 a.m. train. And his family, he freaks everybody out, and his father drops him back into his room. For part two, Gregor is living in this room, and they kind of learn to feed him, and the sister gives him some food, and then the sister's like, maybe we should get rid of all this furniture so we can climb along the walls and the ceilings, because he does seem to enjoy that. But Gregor's not really happy with that because he sees them taking away all of the things from his human life and feels like this is maybe bad. He tries to save some of his possessions from his sister and mother, who are doing this while the father is out. Okay, so he tries to save some stuff, and they leave the room. And he tries to save that picture of the lady he cut out of a magazine. All right, so I'm on middle of page 12, and I'm just gonna keep reading, and we're gonna do a little bit more of this. All right, cool. They had not allowed themselves a long rest and came back quite soon. Greta had put her arm around her mother and was nearly carrying her. What shall we take now, then? They're talking about taking the things out of Gregor's room because he's a bug and he doesn't need furniture anymore. But he thinks maybe he does because he's missing all of his things. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall because he wants to save a picture on the wall of this lady he cut out of a magazine. And so he kind of climbs. He is a cockroach. He climbs on the wall and covers it up with his belly. What shall we take now, then? Said Greta and looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. Perhaps only because her mother was there, she remained calm, bent her face on her so that she would not look around, and, albeit hurriedly and with a tremor in her voice, said, Come on, let's go back to the living room for a while. Gregor could see what Greta had in mind. She wanted to take her mother somewhere safe and then chase him down from the wall. Well, she could certainly try it. He sat unyielding on his picture. He would rather jump at Greta's face because he doesn't want them taking these things out of his room. But of course, they can't understand him when he speaks. And they assume he can't understand them, which is not true. But Greta's words had made her mother quite worried. She stepped to one side, saw the enormous brown patch, that's Gregor, against the flowers on the wallpaper, and before she even realized it was Gregor that she saw, she screamed, Oh God, oh God! Arms outstretched, she fell onto the couch as if she had given up everything and stayed there immobile. Gregor, shouted his sister, glowering at him and shaking her fist. That was the first word she had spoken to him directly since his transformation. She ran into the room to fetch some kind of smelling salts to bring her mother out of a faint. It's like a strong smell. If you faint, you can put something very strong smelling under people's nose and they'll wake up. Gregor wanted to help too. He could save his picture later, although he stuck fast to the glass and had to pull himself off by force. Then he, too, ran into the next room as if he could advise his sister like in the old days. But he had to just stand behind her doing nothing. She was looking into various bottles. He startled her when she turned around. A bottle fell to the ground and broke. A splinter cut Gregor's face, some kind of caustic medicine, like acidic, splashed all over him. Now, without delaying any longer, Greta took hold of all the bottles she could and ran with them into her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. Now Gregor was shut out from his mother, who, because of him, might be near to death. He could not open the door if he did not want to chase his sister away, and she had to stay with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait. And, oppressed with anxiety and self-reproach, he began to crawl about. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, ceiling, and finally, in his confusion, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell down into the middle of the dinner table. He lay there for a while, numb and immobile. All round him it was quiet. Maybe that was a good sign. Then there was someone at the door. The maid, of course, had locked herself in the kitchen so that Greta would have to go and answer it. His father had arrived home. "What's happened?" were his first words. Greta's appearance must have made everything clear to him. She answered him with subdued voice and openly pressed her face into his chest. "Mother's fainted, but she's better now. Gregor got out." "Just as I expected," said his father. "Just as I always said, but you women wouldn't listen, would you?" It was clear to Gregor that Greta had not said enough, and that his father took it to mean that something bad had happened, that he was responsible for some act of violence. That meant Gregor would now have to try to calm his father, as he did not have time to explain things to him, even if that had been possible. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it so that his father, when he came from the hall, could see straight away that Gregor had the best intentions and would go back to his room without delay, that it would not be necessary to drive him back, but that they had only to open the door and he would disappear. His father, though, was not in the mood to notice subtleties like that. "Ah!" he shouted as he came in, sounding as if he were both angry and glad at the same time. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it toward his father. He really had not imagined his father the way he stood there now. Of late, with his new habit of crawling about, he had neglected to pay attention to what was going on the rest of the flat the way he had done before. He really ought to have expected things to have changed. But still, was that really his father? The same tired man as used to be laying there entombed in his bed when Gregor came back from business trips, who would receive him sitting in the armchair in his nightgown when he came back in the evenings, who was hardly even able to stand up, but as a sign of pleasure would just raise his arms, and who, on the couple of times a year when they went for a walk together on Sunday or a public holiday, wrapped tightly in his overcoat between Gregor and his mother, would always labor his way a little more slowly than them, who were already walking slowly for his sake, who would place his stick down carefully, and, if he wanted to say something, would invariably stop and gather his companions around him. He was standing up straight enough now, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, the sort worn by the employees at the banking institute. Above the high, stiff collar of the coat, his strong double chin emerged. Under the bushy eyebrows, his piercing, dark eyes looked out fresh and alert. His normally unkempt white hair was combed down painfully close to his scalp. He took his cap, with its gold monogram, from probably some bank, and threw it in an arc right across the room onto the sofa, put his hands into his trouser pockets, pushing back the bottom of his long uniform coat, and, with a look of determination, he walked toward Gregor. He probably did not know himself what he had in mind, but nonetheless lifted his feet unusually high. Gregor was amazed at the enormous size of the soles of his boots, but wasted no time with that. He knew full well, right from the first day of his life, that his father thought it necessary to always be extremely strict with him. And so he ran up to his father, stopped when his father stopped, scurried forward again when he moved even slightly. In this way, they went around the room several times without anything decisive happening, without even giving the impression of a chase as everything went so slowly. Gregor remained all the time on the floor, largely because he feared his father might see it as especially provoking if he fled onto the wall or ceiling. Whatever he did, Gregor had to admit that he certainly would not be able to keep up this running about for long. For each step his father took, he had to carry out countless movements. He became noticeably short of breath. Even in his earlier life, his lungs had not been very reliable. Now, as he lurched about in his efforts to muster all the strength he could for running, he could hardly keep his eyes open. His thoughts became too slow for him to think of any other way of saving himself than running. He almost forgot the walls were there for him to use, although here they were concealed behind carefully carved furniture full of notches and protrusions. Then right beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Another immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running, as his father has decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the bowl on the sideboard now, without even taking the time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. These little red apples rolled about on the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. Another one, however, immediately following it, hit squarely and lodged in his back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away, as if he could remove the surprising, incredible pain by changing his position, but he felt as if nailed to the spot and spread himself out, all his senses in confusion. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being pulled open. His sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in her blouse, as his sister had taken off some of her clothes after she had fainted to make it easier for her to breathe. She ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding one after another to the ground, stumbling over the skirts. She pushed herself to his father, her arms around him, uniting herself with him totally. Now Gregor lost his ability to see anything. Her hands behind his father's head, begging him to spare Gregor's life. We'll talk about that. That's the end of section 2. Okay, cool. We'll talk about that next video.